Hello everyone, my name is Matthew Silpot and I'm the Education Officer with responsibilities for music in the Ministry of Education, Youth and Information. And today we'll be looking at a music session within the next few minutes, and we're zoning in on the listening and appraising aspect of CSEC. So that's listening and appraisal, normally referred to as LIAP. So, to get into it, a lot of times when we listen, actually there are two types of listening. So you have passive and active. So if you're just listening to music for leisure or for relax, then perhaps that would be passive. But in the context of CSEC, it would be more active listening. So you're listening for things that are very specific. So in this sense, we're going to be talking about how we analyze music that we hear and what are some of the things that are involved in doing that. Right? So let's get right into it. So first of all, commenting on or analyzing music, usually you may be asked to do a comparison of two different types of music or two different composers, or if it's just looking at one, it would be the same concepts involved. So first of all, when we compare and contrast music, that's a skill that we develop, and that should be able to allow you to convey the nuances of any music that you are either performing or listening to. So it shouldn't just be a theoretical exercise. Most of the times that we're listening to music, we're applying theory. So those things that you get in your other sessions where theory is concerned, when you look at listening, or when you're listening to music rather, it comes right into play. Alright? So if we're comparing music, there would be two main areas that we look at. And one, you may be comparing similarities or differences, or you may be comparing how the composer has changed the mood within the set piece. So that's changing the mood, M-O-O-D. Alright? So we'll look at these two aspects a little bit closely. So if you're asked to name the similarities or differences between, let's say for example, two sections, perhaps they will look similar at a glance, but if you zone in a little bit more with your analyzing eyes, you will see differences. So some things that you might want to look at, and in music all the elements are in play, especially in analyzing, and we know some of them. One is rhythm. You want to look closely at the rhythm. You want to look at the melody. You want to look at the dynamics, if there are any. You also may want to look at the phrasing or the articulation that's involved in all of that, right? Also, you want to look at the instrumentation. We talk about instrumentation. It's what are the instruments involved, those types of things. All right. So first, in terms of rhythm, some questions you perhaps can ask yourself. One is that, is the rhythm the same? Is it the same right throughout? Or the values, the note values have changed? Are they changing comparing to each other? In the case of the melody, has the melody been inverted, or in other words, has it been flipped or turned upside down? Has it been transposed into a different octave? Has it been sequenced, meaning that it has moved up and down the scale? What's the movement of the melody like? So those are some of the questions that you want to zone into in terms of analyzing. Dynamics. A lot of times we say dynamics has to do with volume, which it is. But When you want to zone in a little bit more in terms of analysis, are both sections at the same dynamic level, or is there a significant contrast, or there are variations of dynamics right throughout? So you want to look at that. So you want to perhaps look at the markings. Usually you see the markings like forte, piano, pianissimo, mezzo forte. All of these are dynamic markings. Crescendo, decrescendo. That will give you clues in terms of what your dynamics are like in the section. When we look at phrasing and articulation, we're speaking about fluency. Are there legato sections involved? Legato means smoothly, or there are aspects of staccato. Staccato refers to short and detached. Are there accented notes in there, or there are any special effects on the notes? So you want to look more closely for those. So we have legato, staccato, accented notes, or are we doing ties and those types of things? Right? So that's your phrasing and your articulation. In terms of your instrumentation, if you're looking at an orchestral score, and that would involve your strings, brass, woodwind, percussion, all of those, if you're looking at that type of score, then you may want to look at melody and rhythm, those types of things. Is the same melody being played on what instrument? Because usually if you have a full orchestra score, which perhaps can be large or small orchestras, but in those type of situations you usually have more than one instruments playing the melody. Let's say for example, and we know that the setup within each family is SATB. So for example, in your string section, your violin would be your soprano voice, your viola would be your alto, your cello would be your tenor, and your double bass, your bass. And each family has that type of setup in their instrument. So usually you perhaps will have your violins playing the melody most of the time, the other ones doing their accompanying, whether it's homophonic texture or polyphonic, those types of things. So you want to look out for those, right? So is locating the melody sorry, and the rhythm, how they're being introduced, or how are they being facilitated in the score or on the score. So those are things to look at. The next thing we want to look at in terms of is tempo, which is another important element. Is there any indication of a new tempo direction? So your tempo can be in the form of speed. We talk about fast or slow when we're doing your tempo. Has the time signature changed? That could be an indication of tempo as well. So for example, if you were in quadruple and you switched to triple, or let's say for example compound duple, that might be a different thing to be analyzing, right? So that could be an indication. So we have to be careful with those looking at. The next thing now is rhythm and melody. Look at the composer, look at the passages. Has the composer started using longer or shorter note values, or made the melody go either higher or lower? Usually the general note range of a melody is called its tessitura. That word, tessitura, which speaks to range of melody. right? So for example, if you're given an example, you could say the tessitura in this piece has become higher in bars, whatever it is, that, for example. All right, next thing we can look at is texture. And texture has to do with thickness or thinness of sound. So when we talk about texture, you're looking at monophonic texture, you're looking at homophonic texture, you're also looking at polyphonic. So monophonic usually refers to unisons or oneness of sound, so everything sounds the same. Homophonic, you may have two or more melodies that are going on the same line as the melody. So harmonies, for example. So two or more other parts that are accompanying the melody, and these are being played at the same time. So let's say, for example, a chord. So it's a chord is constructed based on 1, 3, 5 of the scale. La la la. If you play all of those at the same time or sing all of those, well, one person cannot sing all of them, but those being sounded at the same time is called homophonic texture, right? Or you have melody and accompaniment, right? And then you have your polyphonic, which you have different melodies at different points. So perhaps a round or a canon or a fugue could be referred to as polyphonic texture, right? So looking at the scores, you would have to distinguish if the texture, how the texture is rather, and comment on those. So those are words that you can use, talk about the monophonic structure, the homophonic structure, or polyphonic as they apply, right? A full orchestra with all instruments playing would have a thick or thin texture. What do you think? If you said thick, then you would be correct, because you have all of these instruments playing together at the same time. So that texture would exemplify the thick one or heavy. If it is reduced to just the string section, for example, then naturally the texture will become thinner or lighter, right? So that's your texture. In terms of modality, which is another term used, modality would refer to your scale or tonality. You hear the term tonality. So it's either, is it major or is it minor? Usually when you say that if it's in major, it's usually a bright sound, almost happy. Minor keys or minor tonalities or modalities refer to darker sounds, for example. So you want to look at your key signature, for example, and look at how the parts are moving together. Even if it kind of suggests major, which is usually, a lot of times people get caught in just looking at it and say, oh, it's major, but without looking at the music and how it's being shaped, where the leading tones are concerned. So you want to be careful of those, right? Articulation is another aspect of it, and you want to look at the change from legato to spiccato, staccato, for example, in those, right? So those are things to look for in your music, right? So just quickly to what we've spoken about. So we've spoken about the rhythm. Rhythm usually refer to duration, so that's short or long. Your melody, you have to look at dynamics. You want to look at the phrasing and articulation. You also want to look at the instrumentation. You want to address tempo, which is short, or speed. Tempo has to do with speed. Sorry, so that's fast or slow. And you want to look at dynamics, which is loud or soft, the volume. You want to look at the rhythm and the melody, and in terms of the tessitura, which is our word that speaks to the range. Is it higher in octave? How is it moving? You want to look at texture, which is the thickness or thinness of sound. Modality or tonality is one else to look at, changing from minor to major, and articulation. So those are concepts that you can use. So for example, in terms of your analysis on the music, you can speak to the tempo. Is at one section he has become a little slower, but it changes tempo, going through bars that. Talk about the dynamics, slightly quieter, for example. The rhythm is built off longer note values. You can talk about crotchets and minims, or half and quarter notes, compared to the quavers and semiquavers that were there before. So some aspect of texture, you could speak to the texture being lighter or heavier, because not all the instruments are playing at the same time, or all the instruments are being played at the same time. You could speak to tonality in terms of modulation, like for example the key has changed to B flat major, and so on and so forth. In terms of articulation, speak to the technique of instruments or playing instruments. So articulation has been changed, for example, from a tongued sub-staccato, and that could speak to wind instruments, to legato, which is more fluent or smooth. You could talk about the mood of the piece and talk about the overall effect. Would be, so for example, the mood has changed from a big fanfare or majestic sound to a calmer, more sedate feeling, for example. So that will take care of all of those aspects, right? So when we talk about analysis of music, we normally look at the periods within the Western art culture and what happened. So our timelines, for example, they're usually broken down into like 100 years in terms of the years. So for example, the Baroque period, which was from the 1600s to the 1700s. You have the classical period, which is from 1700s to the 1800s, or romantic period from the 1800s to the 1900s, and our modern 20th century periods would be from 1900s onwards, stepping it into the 21st century. So those are your periods that we look at in music. So Baroque, classical, romantic, and modern or 20th century music. Those are what we call them. In terms of the composers that are associated with these timelines. So for example, in your Baroque timeline, you have composers such as Johann Sebastian Bach, you have Henri Purcell, and you have Friedrich Handel. So those are some of the big names around the Baroque period. And if you know any famous work by Bach, like air and a G string. Handel would be like, if those of you listen to oratorios, like the Messiah, some of his orchestral works, or and then you have like Purcell normally dealt with solos, like airs, that type of thing. In terms of our classical composers, we have the Mozarts, Schubert, Haydn, Beethoven, just to name a few. For the romantic side, there's this composer called Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Mendelssohn, Wagner, Tchaikovsky, Verdi, Berlioz, Dvorak, so those to name a few. And in our modern era, we have Debussy, Ireland, Shostakovich, Gershwin, Britten, that's Benjamin Britten, Stockhausen. So those of you who do like operas, musicals, George Gershwin might perhaps will be a popular name. That's around that timeline. So you can look for those. While some composers, like for example Mozart, were very prolific and they wrote many genres, so they could. Mozart wrote for instruments, he wrote for orchestra, he wrote for voice and orchestra. You have other composers who just focused on a few type of composition, and some of these we can highlight. Like for example, Chopin, Liszt, and Rachmaninoff, they really focused on piano music or piano with orchestras. So though they stayed in those types of styles, right? Strauss, he looked at waltzes, so anything, and we know that waltz is usually a real triple. Verdi and Wagner, they were on the opera side, so they stayed on that. And Sir Schubert, he did a lot of leader songs. A lead is what they consider to be an art song, and that's usually for voice and piano. And yeah, so we could take a walk with all of those, with those skills in mind, and probably zone in a little bit more on the composers themselves. I know that we do a walk in history, but we can look at the composers in detail when we're listening. So let us put our listening skills to the test. And let's listen to something, and then we can see if we can analyze just a little bit. So what I'm going to be playing for you in just a couple of minutes or so, it's a composition by Johann Sebastian Bach, one of his famous pieces that's called Air on a G string. And this one is for my orchestral suite, number 3, and it's in D major, right? And do you remember where Sir Bach was from, the era? He was from the Baroque aspect of the period. So listen. And this was mostly orchestra. There's an instrument called a harpsichord. if we were to analyze this, what are some of the things you could identify within it? What are some of the elements that are there that you could identify? Let's say, for example, let's talk about texture. Would you consider this texture to be thin or thick? What about the instrumentation? What instruments are involved here? What are you hearing? If we're looking at a string section, then we could talk about the violins, violas, cellos, and double basses. And there's another instrument in play, which is what we call the harpsichord, one of the very first keyboard instruments around. Right? Let's talk about phrasing and articulation. How could you describe this? Is it smooth and ongoing, giving you a calm feeling, or is it staccato, detached? What is happening with the melody? What could you say about the tessitura? How is it organized? How are we describing the dynamics? Is it on one level? Could we say it's piano? Is it mezzo forte, meaning moderately loud? Piano is soft, forte is loud. Do you have aspects where the melody diminishes a little bit, or there are some aspects where it really comes out to create an intense feeling? So those are some of the things we could address. What about tempo? How could we describe the tempo? And then we could even go to tonality. What would be the tonality of this piece? Is it in major or minor? And that would be for you to find out. So these are things that you could put down on your little checklist, talk about them, pointers in terms of how you're aligning what we discuss to what you're listening to. So be more active in the listening, in identifying these things. Yeah? Make it a little bit comparative to probably another genre of music, and you could talk about the stylistic features. All right, so that's it for today. We've covered how you analyze and how you talk about the mood of music, using the elements. The elements of music go right throughout anything that we're doing, and how we are using the different timelines in music, or how do we identify the different timelines and some of the composers that we have discussed. So until next time, I am Matthew Silpot again, and we will take it to another level on the next time in terms of our analyzing and or identifying of elements in listening to music.